Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Archetypes in the News for ANN, the Archetypal News Network. Today's Friday, March 26, 2021, and I'm Chad Harris, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to come to you on a weekly basis to explore events in the news and politics and the cultural arts. And I'd like to just begin by giving my thanks to Ren Butler and James Moran and the rest of the crew that put together this amazing network, and inviting me to join the excellent presenters that are also involved on this channel. Today's episode, we will be exploring the unfortunate events that took place in Boulder this week and Atlanta, and we'll also be looking at Donald Trump's presidency, specifically related to his relationship to Saturn and the Saturn cycle through his life leading up to the insurrection, and the ways in which he has been held accountable for his actions and the way he has not been held to account for those actions. So let's dive right in. It turns out both of the shooters in Atlanta and in Boulder happen to be 21 years old. And what's interesting about that is that there's the early adult crisis transits, as they're sometimes called, which are the second Saturn square and the first Uranus square. And what that means is the Saturn cycle is our cycle of maturation, how we develop and differentiate from our parents and move into authorship of our own lives. And it has to do with that process of differentiation and becoming an adult. And what happens is at 7, between 6 and 8, it squares itself, and then at 14 it opposes itself, and then between 20 and 22 it squares itself again before coming back to the Saturn return between 28 and 32. And so that last square tends to be a really important period in one's life where there is kind of a crisis of moving out of adolescence and moving into adulthood. And interestingly, is it that period 18 to 22 also corresponds to the first Uranus square. So Uranus being just moved into the first 90-degree relationship to where it was when one was born. And the combination of these two transits together tends to produce a crisis, which has to do with the maturational cycle, the cycle of differentiation and autonomy and authorship of adulthood, and then liberation and freedom. And Uranus is the unique part of who we are, and it wants to break free of Saturnian constraints and responsibilities and tradition and stuff like that. So there's a tendency to want to find one's unique gifts and capacities for unique self-expression. So it's an interesting kind of crucible of that, a rite of passage in essence. And it seems as though both of the shooters were, in essence, in a complicated relationship to these transits. And so what we're looking at here is actually Ahmad Alissa's natal chart on the inside, and just giving you an idea of how this happens. So this is the Saturn square to natal Saturn, and the first Uranus square to natal Uranus. And additionally, in 1999, we can recognize that there, at least for part of the year, there was a Saturn square Neptune that was taking place as well, which corresponds at least to Ahmed's biography. So, and one thing I noticed just today is that Neptune in the sky, transiting Neptune, is in the halfway position between where it was in 99 and where Saturn was in 99. So my point is that it's in a semi-square to Saturn in today, or in 99, and it's in a semi-square to itself in 99 where Neptune was in 1999. And the combination of those, it seems to be in essence, bringing the Saturn-Neptune square from 99 into some type of manifestation challenged by Neptune, in a sense. So this is Ahmed's chart, and what we can recognize is that he was born with Mars in a T-square with Neptune and Saturn. So it's in opposition here to Saturn and the square to Neptune. And the Saturn-Neptune combination has a tremendous amount of noble potential expressions. Many of the greatest artists and devoted spiritual practitioners have Neptune-Saturn in hard aspect. But what it also can correspond to, Neptune correlates to our imagination and the stream and flow of consciousness. And in essence, in a certain sense, the way we perceive the world, our worldview. And Saturn corresponds to the reality principle, right and wrong, our superego, our conscience, and the Saturn Neptune combination and its shadow manifestations can produce paranoia and mental disturbances, because the stream and flow of consciousness of Neptune is challenged by potentially pessimistic, or dark thinking of Saturn, problematic thinking. And so the combination can be challenging to make sense of reality in a healthy way, where we feel as though the stream and flow of consciousness is grounded in a healthy dynamic rather than being disturbed in a pathological way. The reason I bring this up is because it is reported that he suffers from paranoia and has some mental disturbances taking place. We also know from his biography that he was a wrestler. And you often see with Mars-Saturn combinations a tendency towards needing to express one's assertive, potentially aggressive side of who we are, Mars, the warrior, with Saturn meeting resistance. Saturn is the reality principle, but it's like physical structures, and a lot of construction workers and boxers have Mars Saturn. It tends towards assertiveness and needing resistance to it, like exercise is great for it in wrestling, but also there can be a shadow side where there's a reactionary part of it, where Saturn can feel as though it has been slighted and it has a defense mechanism, and when it comes in to defend itself with Mars, it can be reactionary in a way that's like it feels like it's attacked, and then it attacks, and so there's a back and forth between those two principles. And this seems to have been part of potentially what was taking place in Ahmed's experience. And another thing we can recognize here when we look at his actual specific transits for the shooting, not only was the double Saturn-Uranus taking place, so Uranus in the sky was conjoining natal Saturn, and Saturn in the sky was conjoining natal Uranus, both squaring each other themselves. In addition to that, we can also recognize that transiting Mars in the sky was in an exact opposition to his natal Pluto, and Pluto in the sky, 26 Capricorn, was in an exact square to his natal Sun. So the combination of all of these factors points towards, the sudden unexpected or disruption of psychological stability on some level, or the breakdown of reality, the sudden unexpected break from the past and breaking through in some whole new reality that's taking place. But in this difficult or really dark manifestation, we see Mars, where it's the warrior, the potential for violence, in the exact opposition to Pluto, and Pluto is the depth of potential violence. Pluto is the instincts, the will to survive. It's the part of us that can kill if we're being drowned. If our life is threatened, it's the instinct to survive. So like with Mars there, it gives it an extra kind of assertive, potentially lethal, direct action. And additionally, Mercury in the sky was in a square to Mars and a square to his natal Pluto. So the Mercury square Mars you often see when aggressive thinking or irritable thinking turns into violence, into overly assertive actions. And this seems to have potentially played a role in both of the shootings. And I think we should also look at something I didn't mention is there was a 22-year-old who was caught, I think yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, again in Atlanta, in a Publix, another grocery store, with this cache of weapons. So this was potentially the third mass shooting in a week that was actually stopped by an alert citizen who recognized or saw the man go into the bathroom. So, basically, this seems to be part of the, overall challenging complexes that these children were born with at this time, the Saturn square Uranus period and potentially Saturn square Neptune as well. So if you happen to know anyone between 18 and 23, really 17 to 23, maybe reach out and check in, because it's clearly a difficult rite of passage time period for them, and they're most likely going through a lot. And just to, have someone see them and make them feel as though they belong and they are meant to be here and they're seen, could make, could really help them out in a really a difficult time. So now we're going to explore Donald Trump and his relationship to the archetype of Saturn. And we're going to explore quickly the eclipses through the course of his presidency, leading right up to the insurrection. And for those of you who followed my research on this topic, you'll know there are, several videos where I really unpack his natal chart. But today we're just going to focus on two complexes that he really shines forth, which are he's born with Mars rising, and the Bob Woodward book was called Rage, and the rage is Mars. This is his like tendency to attack everyone. He's constantly leading with that berating quality, and additionally, it's in what's called a midpoint alignment with Saturn and Pluto. So Saturn and Mars, the midpoint of Saturn and Mars is 10 degrees and 17 minutes Leo, which is just 15 minutes off of a direct, exact conjunction with his natal Pluto. And so what happens is it draws all three of these archetypes together. And when you add Saturn and Pluto, you get a tendency towards psychological splitting and othering. So like Saturn creates boundaries, and Pluto is intensifying those boundaries, and we tend to identify all the good in the world and place it inside of those boundaries, and we often can project evil, what we fear, the darker aspects of reality, Pluto, onto the other. And the complex tends to manifest in a way where we will often feel as though the other, with all of that evil that we've projected onto them, needs to be destroyed in order for all the good in the world to survive. And you can see this over and over again in the wall and all of the racist comments, and it's just misogyny. It's a really distinct archetypal complex in his being. So now we're going to look at the Saturn cycle through the course of his life and relative to his actions and how he's been held to account for those actions or not. So there's a famous story when he was 7 years old that he was at dinner table with his family, and he had been torturing his younger brother, which he often did, and no one could stop him. His mother couldn't prevent him. She kept trying to stop him from, keep beating up on him, but he wouldn't stop. He was relentless about it. And what happens is his older brother, Freddie Jr., is 7 years older than Donald, and he takes a bowl of mashed potatoes and he dumps it on his head. And Donald is completely humiliated by this, and he still carries it around as a mark of shame. And we know this from Mary Trump's accounts, and it's a fascinating story because when it's brought up to him even today, he can't laugh about it. He has a lot of angst that comes up and resistance, and he gets all uncomfortable. And this is a part of the Saturn aspect of being held to account for your actions and the actual accountability, which he couldn't rein in himself. Then it had to be from the outside. So if you're not, like Nietzsche has said, he who cannot obey himself will be commanded. And that's a really important kind of insight into the nature of Saturn, of like, if you can, develop your own authority and discipline yourself, then you don't have to be disciplined from the outside. And so this is one of those first events that was ultimately a very shameful one for him. And then he gets sent to military school when Saturn moves into the opposition to natal Saturn. So this is the very beginning. And then through that course of his military schooling for 3 or 4 years, this Saturn opposition was taking place. And again, this happened because he couldn't discipline himself, and his mother couldn't discipline him, or his father. And so he had to be sent to military school to be disciplined. Now, at the Saturn opposition, 14 years later, he had taken the job at the Saturn Square with his father, but then he becomes president already at a young age, and they get sued by the government, and this is where he meets Roy Cohn, and they countersue the government, and I think they lost, but they didn't get as many consequences because of the way they countersued the government. And so this is, in essence, is one of those kind of really important markers where he actually got away with the racial discrimination, or at least him and his father at this point. But the next alignment is really interesting. This is the next Saturn square, 14 Libra. It's moving into the square with natal Saturn, the first waxing square. And this is when he actually branches out on his own and gets a gaming license. So he had been raised in real estate development, and he wanted to do something different than what his father had been doing all of this time. And so he branches out and gets a gaming license, and he's going to go into the casino world. And it's just 7 years later, when Saturn moves into the opposition with natal Saturn, that he has his first bankruptcy in 1990. Now, this is a really important period. I'm not going to go into the depth, but not only did he have his first bankruptcy and actually genuinely be held to account for his actions, because he was going into bankruptcy, he actually attempted to steal his father's empire. And it's a long, complicated story, but he actually got caught. And but instead of kind of punishing him and whatnot, they recognized, because the reason he wanted to steal his father's empire was because he realized that his father was going to pass away within probably 10 years or so, and that they would lose half of the value in taxes, that the government would take half of the value. And so they actually schemed together, the whole family schemes together at this point, to siphon off the assets to the children, so that when he does die, they don't have to pay taxes on it. So again, more just, this all comes back to Trump's lack of integrity, which is a Saturn phenomenon as well. And when you don't have integrity in yourself and live up to those standards, they have to be, you draw them towards you as fate, as Carl Jung would say, and they become the karmic consequences of your actions. So the next alignment, this is interesting. I mean, this is 21 years later, but when Saturn moved back to the first square, where the mashed potatoes and the gaming license, this is when the White House Correspondents' Dinner takes place, and he actually is humiliated by Barack Obama. If you've seen the footage, he's sitting there just like everyone else is laughing, and he can't laugh. He can't break a smile. It's like, this. You can see the humiliation, you can see the shame that he's just carrying. And it's fascinating to me that this is the actual Saturn return, the second Saturn return for when he was 7 years old, and the initial shaming at the dinner table. I don't think that's an accident. So then we move into his presidency. And in the first year of his presidency, the Charlottesville incident happened, and Charlottesville, the event, took place 10 days or so before this eclipse, the Great American Eclipse, which happened to take place at 28 degrees Leo, right on his ascendant and conjoining his natal Mars. And what did he do at that time? He sanctioned the violent rhetoric of the neo-Nazis at Charlottesville. He basically looked the other way, gave him a wink wink. And what's additionally fascinating, is that this eclipse, the Great American Eclipse, it starts in Lincoln City, Oregon, crosses Lincoln, Nebraska, and ends crossing Fort Sumter, South Carolina, which is where the Civil War began. Dale O'Brien was the first astrologer to recognize this pattern. And to me, it's clear, this is a shadow revelation of the United States, the racist history of of slavery and the Civil War that we, nobly achieved the emancipation of African Americans. So the next eclipse happened to take place just, I think it was 2 days before the Helsinki summit, where he basically betrays the United States by siding with Vladimir Putin. And the eclipse at 20 Cancer is conjoining his natal Saturn, which in essence revealed the depth of his corruptness. He has no integrity. He doesn't actually believe in right and wrong in a sense of what's actually valuable, other than what's valuable for himself, and he's willing to betray any actual commitments he's made, like the oath of office or whatever, any oath that he's ever taken to anyone. He's betrayed everyone in his life. So this is again the lack of integrity that is instilled in the basic nature of his relationship to Saturn. And in essence, you can see that it was revealed here at this point. And furthermore, this is when Pluto was just really beginning to begin to oppose his natal Saturn, which brings in an extra level of karmic potentialities. And this is also the beginning, the very earliest stages of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which we have been in for the past 3 years and are still in for this next year. So the next alignment, the next eclipse that is, happened. This was 3 weeks before the perfect phone call, which got him impeached. So the conjunction, the eclipse at 10 Cancer, was conjoining his natal Mercury, the perfect call. So like it's revealing the shadow of his mercurial inconsistencies. And again, this is when the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is forming tight opposition to his natal Saturn. He's being held to account for those actions, it seems. So here's a chart for the perfect call, the actual call, July 25th. And this is interesting because Mercury was conjoining his natal Saturn, and Mercury is the mind, the voice, the call, the speaking, the conversation on the call. And Saturn is the problematic dimensions of it, the consequences of the decisions, the consequences of what is spoken. And we'll see this again and again. I don't have it listed here, but Mercury, I believe it was at 25 Aries when he fired James Comey, which is what initiated the Russia investigation. And then it's also there for the perfect call, as we see, and it happens again when he suggests injecting bleach, which we'll see in a second. So, but this is probably the most important moment of his presidency in large ways, which is National Security Advisor Dale O'Brien, not Dale O'Brien, I forget his first name, O'Brien, said to Trump, "This is going to be the biggest threat to your presidency," talking about the emergence of the COVID pandemic. And of course, he didn't heed that warning, and the consequences of his inaction are laid bare for all of us to see now. So, interestingly, when he actually did suggest drinking or injecting bleach as a potential cure for the coronavirus, Mercury back to the same place it was when he fired James Comey, in a tight square to his natal Saturn, and squaring Pluto in the sky. And what we're seeing here is the consequences of the decision, the consequences of suggesting bleach. I mean, this was the last task force briefing that they gave until July. Like, he just had to stop doing them because they couldn't count on him to speak coherently. So, interestingly, this is one of the main predictions that I actually gave, which was on March 9th, which is just on March 6th he went to the CDC, and you could tell in that press briefing that he was completely checked out. He was going to play golf. He didn't understand the depth of the problem, and he wasn't going to, and he was blowing it off. And it was clear to me at that moment that he was going to suffer serious consequences for not heeding the COVID pandemic with the proper respect that it deserved. And it turns out I didn't just say that he would lose the election. I actually said that in October of 2020 that potentially some important consequences would take place relative to his decisions around COVID in particular, because Saturn was moving retrograde back to the final opposition to his natal Saturn. So like Saturn had been in opposition to his natal Saturn for about a year and a half or so. And often what you see when Saturn is transiting itself, or any Saturn transit, any transit at all, basically, if you haven't integrated what the transit is kind of asking of you, if you haven't integrated what you need, or what you need to integrate from it, often it's that last square, the last station where it's in orb, that the consequences of that inaction will be made, will come home to roost. And this is exactly what happened. It was right during that week, in the last week of September, early first week of October, that Saturn made that final station. And he actually caught COVID and had the worst debate performance in history of debates, and basically at this point began to lose the election. And that's kind of what I was saying would happen because of him, because he wasn't taking it as seriously, Saturn, as he needed to. And so what takes place on the election night is another one of those Mercury positions where Mercury is actually stationing, and it's tight square to his natal Saturn again. And what did he do? He came out on November 4th, the night of the election, in 2 in the morning, when um, it was. He basically came out and said that it was fraud, and started the big lie. And the consequences of that decision will were still yet to be made fully manifest, and um, I think they're going to be really significant. But another thing that I predicted was that he would have some type of full shadow revelation, a revelation of a full depth of his shadow, because there was an eclipse, a solar eclipse on December 14th, 2020, which took place at 23 degrees Sagittarius, which is just 1 degree opposition to his sun and 2 degrees conjoining his natal moon. Now, what this indicated to me was that you know eclipses are a play of shadow, and it's the moon is getting in front of the sun and allowing and producing a shadow, and in essence it seems to reflect often um, shadow material coming into consciousness. And this is what we saw. We saw the full depth of his shadow, in essence, that he was willing to incite an insurrection to try and overthrow the legitimately elected president. And, that's about as, I mean, of course it could get much worse in essence, potentially, but that's a pretty deep level of shadow revelation, and it led to his second impeachment. Um, so if we actually look at the insurrection itself, this is January 6th, what we can recognize is that, again, Mercury on that same axis, opposite natal Saturn, and he gave, the most disgraceful speech in presidential history, and it led directly to a Mars-Uranus violent insurrection that was, we can actually see this whole thing. It's Mars opposite the Moon in a T-square with Pluto, and Mercury opposite is natal Saturn. So what's actually being formed here is a grand cross between Mars and Saturn, Mars and the Moon, Mars and Pluto, Pluto and the Moon, Pluto and Saturn. And this is the finale. This is, you know, the last shadow revelation of his presidency. So yeah, the consequences of these actions are going to be extremely long lasting. The big lie is it's created a fascist party. The Republican Party is becoming a party of an autocratic party, and they're not even attempting to broaden their party anymore. They're just doubling down on voter suppression, and you know this is a extremely difficult situation that we are entering into collectively, and it's basically a battle for democracy, and yeah, it's going to require everything we have to meet it with an intense, fierce compassion, because you know we have to have compassion and understanding for our brothers and sisters on the other side of the aisle, but like this is quickly becoming something that is very difficult to negotiate with compromise, because you can't compromise with fascists, you can't compromise with dictators, with autocratic, violent people. It's not something that can be done. You have to meet it with some type of resistance that puts it in its place. So, yeah, it's a really difficult situation we're entering into, but I do always have hope. I am a very optimistic person in general. And what I would like to point out here is that just like in October, early October of this last year, the Saturn and Pluto will be stationing within a week in the first week of October. And they're going to do this both in opposition to natal Pluto, Saturn opposite natal Pluto, and Pluto opposite natal Saturn. So he's going to get double time, Saturn opposite Pluto, and he very well may be indicted. And honestly, this is again my bias, my projection, but it needs to happen because, this is the most egregious action by any president in history. And if he's not held to account, it's actually a damning, it's damning for the United States. Like, Israel, France, other Western democracies, they have placed former leaders in jail, in prison, when they were held to account for their corruption. And if we can't do that, that will be a big stain on the United States. And I, I, I actually, I really believe that this is important that he is held to account in some way because, I didn't even go into this, but we'll explore it in another episode. But what's really fascinating is the Saturn-Pluto square in 92 to 94 corresponded to the Ruby Ridge incident, to Waco, and to Timothy McVeigh's being inspired by those incidences and the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And what you can see is that the Saturn-Pluto combination has a lot to do with protection, Saturn, and Pluto is weapons. So the gun rights is guns are Pluto, violence, and the rights are Saturn, but then also the banning of assault weapons is a Saturn-Pluto phenomenon. And what's really interesting is that in 1994, in the crime bill, Bill Clinton passed this first assault weapons ban in 1994, and it was successful. It was a 10-year ban, and it expired in 2004. But what's really interesting about it is that the Republicans swept the House with Newt Gingrich in 94, and in the exit polling for that election, the highest voted exit poll reason for why people voted was against this assault weapons ban. It was the highest reason for the Republican votes, or like the background noise was they were striving to eliminate the assault weapons ban, and by electing Republicans into the House, that was the goal behind their fear, Saturn, of having their weapons, Pluto, taken away from them or being restricted, Saturn. And it's interesting because this is coming up again. We're still in the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and assault weapons ban will be on the table on some form, potentially, or gun rights are clearly on the table at this point. So, yeah, this is just some of the insights that I've seen relative to Trump and his history of accountability or lack thereof, and just the general situation that we're all in. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to further discussions next week and the week after. And yes, I hope everyone be well, and we'll see you next week. Take care.